Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be going through some passages and then answering the questions related to them. And I scored in the 99th percentile on the MCAT, so with this video I'm trying to show you how I would look at a passage, look at what information matters and what doesn't, and how I would break down the passage, and then how I approach all the questions, how I see what the question is asking me, and then go through all the answer options, see what's correct, what's incorrect, eliminate them one by one until I have the final correct answer. So hopefully me going through these passages will show you a right approach or like the approach that I used, and if you apply these techniques that should help you increase your score as well. Of course, if you have any additional questions, leave them in the comments below, but as I go through all these questions I won't assume that you know too much background knowledge. Like, of course, I'll assume you have done some studying for the MCAT, but all the information that you need for a question, what is present in the passage, I'll try to show you where it is and how you can use that information to answer the questions. So without any further delay, let's get through the passages. Okay, with this last passage, we're going to change things up a little bit. Instead of doing more chemistry, we're now going to do a passage on cars. So because this is cars, just bear with me. Cars, yes, it's very difficult to go through it and figure out the right answers, but it's just as difficult to kind of get across why something is the correct or incorrect answer for these videos. So a lot of the times, like, I try to explain what the main point of like a passage is, and then I get to a question and then like I know that this is the correct answer, but then it's kind of hard to eliminate the other answers, and the reasoning is just it's incorrect because that's not what the author said. So that is frustrating, but I guess for cars, more so focus on figuring out what the author is actually trying to imply with the passage and look for the correct answer, and that oftentimes helps you more so in cars than trying to eliminate other answers until only one remains. That methodology works better for the other sections. So yeah, so I might ramble on for a lot of the answer explanations, but just bear with me. So before we start, just letting you know, for every cars that I go through, the main way that I look at it, everyone has like their own way of approaching cars. What I do is I try to read the passage, and then usually when I'm reading it in my head, a lot of times it's pretty dry, but I try to read it with a bit of enthusiasm and like I actually care about the subject. And then what I care about for every paragraph that I read is, okay, let me try to sum it up in like one sentence or two sentences. What was the purpose of that paragraph? That's a key thing. Every single paragraph, what was the purpose of that paragraph? What was the like main takeaway from that paragraph? And then when you finish the passage, what was the overall purpose of the passage? And then two other things to look out for. One, was the author's viewpoint present? Are they showing that they care about this topic one way or the other, or are they just, unbiased, ambivalent about a topic? And then lastly, like, for every single thing that's there, like, what is the purpose of a paragraph or like a sentence? Because a lot of times AAMC will ask you, like, this sentence, why was it there? And then the reason is because it was evidence for a claim that was made previously. So those three things: the purpose of a paragraph or sentence, and then the main takeaway from every single paragraph, and then if the author's viewpoint is there or not. So now I'll read the actual passage. The relationship of the professional artist to the class that ruled or aspired to rule was complicated, various, and should not be simplified. The artist's training, however, and it was training which made the artist a professional, taught the artist a set of conventional skills. That is to say, the artist became skilled in using a set of conventions of composition, drawing, perspective, however you say this word, chiaroscuro, whatever, anatomy, poses, symbolism. And these conventions corresponded so closely to the social experience, or anyway to the social manners, of the class the artist was serving, that they were not even seen as conventions, but were thought of as only the way of recording and preserving eternal truths. Yet to the other social classes, such professional painting appeared to be so remote from their own experience that they saw it as a mere social convention, a mere accoutrement of the class that ruled over them, which is why in moments of revolt, painting and sculpture were often destroyed. So this intro paragraph is telling us that pretty much training made an artist. Okay, that is, when I read this paragraph, that's the main takeaway that I take from this. The author believes, and the author's viewpoint is present here, that training makes the artist, and they're kind of constricted by whatever training they have. Like, the training is a convention. The convention corresponded to the class the artist was serving. So the class that the artist is serving gives him training, and if it's like the upper class, it's going to be training for upper class values, and then the training that an artist receives, that is limiting them in the type of art which they can make. And then there's other stuff in the paragraph, but that's the main takeaway. Moving on, it says, during the 19th century, certain artists, for consciously social or political reasons, tried to extend the professional tradition of painting so that it might express the experience of other classes. Their personal struggles, their failures, and the opposition they met with were a measure of the ambition of the undertaking. Perhaps one pedestrian example will give some idea of the extent of the difficulties involved. Consider Ford Madox Brown's well-known painting of Work. It shows a team of laborers with passers-by and bystanders working on a sidewalk. It took the painter 10 years to complete, and it is, at one level, extremely accurate. But it looks like a religious scene. Some would argue that this is because the artist's attitude to his subject was ambivalent. I would argue that all the visual means he was using with such care preempted the possibility of depicting manual work as the main subject of a painting in any but a mythological or symbolic way. So I would argue that should definitely stand out to you. Also, example. So these are some main things in this paragraph. The author of the paragraph gave an example of something to illustrate their point, and also they use the words "I would argue that." So very clearly they're showing where they stand in this case. But the main takeaway from this paragraph, once again, it's that whatever training you have, those are the values you're going to be constricted by. So in this case, the author is saying that sometimes, and he gave an example, or he or she gave an example, that sometimes artists try to go outside of the conventions of whatever learning they've received, but it doesn't really work successfully. So in this example, Brown made a painting, even though it took so long, it took 10 years to complete. It was accurate in like the subject that it was portraying, but if you actually look at it, it looks like a religious subject or painting, which is obviously not how something that's just like a normal everyday like scene that you see should be painted. And so the author is arguing that because of the training that the artist received, they couldn't paint the subject in any way but a mythological or a symbolic way. And so once again, this is like the values of the upper class, right? The upper class cares a lot about, I guess, like during the 19th century, that's the time that we're talking about depicting like scenes from religion and just making them like very symbolic and like beautiful in a certain way, that it's not just an everyday scene that you see when you're just walking down the street. There's more to it. So even though this person was trying to paint an everyday scene, they were limited by their training. So once again, limited by training. And just as a side note, if you begin reading a lot more of these CARS passages, especially if you read passages from AAMC and you use this technique, this paragraph was the main point of it, second paragraph was the main point, third paragraph, again and again you'll see that even though like different paragraphs have a small thing that they're focusing on, overall their main takeaway is the same thing. So you'll just get hammered by the main point again and again, and then if you're actually looking for it, you will, it'll be so obvious to you, and then later on all the questions that the AAMC will ask you will be testing if you understood the main point or not. So once again, for the second one, the main point was that the author thinks that artists are held back by the training they receive, and we're going to be hit with this point again and again. The crisis provoked by those who tried to extend the area of experience to which painting might be open, that continued into the 20th century, but its terms were reversed. The tradition was indeed dismantled. Yet, except for the introduction of the unconscious, the area of experience from which most European artists drew remained surprisingly unchanged. Consequently, most of the Sears art of the period dealt either with the experience of various kinds of isolation or with the narrow experience of painting itself. The latter produced painting about painting, which is abstract art. Once again, the author of the passage is saying that even though like this continued, people were trying to be more open with painting, they were still held back by whatever training they had. And the only time where they could paint other things were when it came from their unconscious, but that still is like things that they have experienced, right? So, and then painting, that's abstract art, but for the most part, like things that you have experienced and have like actual learning in, that is holding you back in the painting you can make. Next, it says one of the reasons the potential freedom gained by the dismantling of the tradition was not used may be the way painters were still trained. In the academies and art schools, they first learned those very conventions which were being dismantled. This was because no other professional body of knowledge existed to be taught. So, moving forward a bit in time, the author is saying, even though like some things were being dismantled, like there isn't so much like the ruling class now controls painting, and like other people, paintings mean nothing to them and they will destroy them. Now paintings, they do reflect things which people can relate to regardless of their class. So even like lower classes have paintings which they can relate to, but there's still difficulty for painters to paint those subjects, because even though like those things are being dismantled, that way of thinking, the way that painters learn is through like professional schools, and those are still teaching you values of the upper class. And final paragraph, thus the extreme of abstract art demonstrates, as an epilogue, the original uncertainty of professional art, an art in reality concerned with a selective, very reduced area of experience, which nevertheless claims to be universal. So once again, people are limited by their own experiences and the training they've had. So like when artists, they seem to know, or like of course they know a lot about painting, and when they paint about painting, they're making abstract art, but that doesn't really mean much. Like a lot of the general population doesn't really get what's going on with abstract art, and you might not really get it unless you are a painter yourself. So it's a limited thing, limited area which it connects with, a limited area of experience, and artists are claiming that that is something which is universal, but the author of the passage is claiming that it's not. It really only relates to what the artists have learned. Those are the things which they can make paintings about. Okay, so yeah, I kind of hit you over the head with the main argument of the passage, but like it's better to do that and kind of just be annoyed that you're hit over the head with the main argument than to not understand the main argument. So when I keep reading something and I see, okay, I'm being hit over the head with this again and again, like that makes me happy, because that means that I'm going to fly through the questions. So getting to the questions. Question 88. So of course with all these, pause it and try to see what you think is the correct answer. But now I'll get through the questions. Question 88. The main argument of the passage is what? So straight up, we should be able to answer this one. Main argument of the passage is that the author believes that artists are limited in what they can express in their paintings by the training they have received, and then that training will reflect the values of whichever class or group of people administer the training. So option A is saying, main argument is that the relationship between artists and the ruling classes throughout history has been complex and difficult to understand. That's kind of like a sentence that was discussed at the beginning, that it's a difficult topic, it's not something which should be simplified, but that's not the main argument of the passage. B, artists of the past required strong professional training in order to do work that would appeal to the ruling classes. No. There was one example which showed that somebody painted something and it took them 10 years and they were trying to appeal to the ruling classes, not the lower classes. Well, it's not just that like the artist is saying that you need a lot of training to appeal to the ruling classes. Just people that are very good painters, of course they need a lot of training to get to the level where they're good painters, and then most of the time the training that they got, whether or not, like there were different systems back then, right? Like whether you went to a school or you were gifted and then you had like a patron that was like rich and they were sponsoring you, whatever the case may be, based on the type of training you received, that is what was limiting you. So it's not the fact that they required strong professional training. It's more so what was the effect of that training, that the main argument of the passage is. Option C, which is our correct answer here, is that the professional training of artists has served to limit the areas of experience from which they draw their subjects. Yeah, by this point, this is immediately what everyone should have chosen. Option D is saying, main argument is that artists who attempt to abandon conventional methods must confront a great deal of opposition from the ruling classes. Like, nowhere was it mentioned that the ruling classes are against this and that they fight against. Actually, it was mentioned, sorry. Yeah, it was mentioned over here. In the 19th century, artists were trying to express painting to other classes, and then they met with personal struggles, failures, and opposition. Yes, that was something which was mentioned, but it's not the main argument of the passage. The passage wasn't going on and on about people abandoning a conventional method and then they face opposition. That point was just there to show that they faced a lot of opposition, but they still went for it. So there was some reason that those artists really cared about appealing to the lower classes as well. But the main argument was, even though they tried, they didn't really meet the mark. So moving on from that question. Question 89. In the context of the passage, the term tradition refers primarily to the what? So, classic MCAT question. They'll ask you what a word means, and then, like, a lot of times, like, don't overthink this. In the past, I have, like, seen a word, and I'm like, I know the definition of that word, but I overthink it and I choose something else. Like, just most basically, whatever the definition of the word is, the first thing that comes to your head, and then also, like, of course, look at the context of the passage. That is the answer option which you should go for. It's usually a simple question. So tradition, what is it referring to? In this case, without even going back to the passage, I would think tradition is referring to, like, traditionally the ways that artists were taught, the training that they received, and then those traditions led them to paint in a certain way. So let's just go back and look throughout and see where we see the word tradition. So whenever I get to a question like that, I know that I'm looking for the word tradition, so I quickly, like, speed read through the entire passage and look for wherever I see the word tradition. And then, of course, this is timed on the MCAT, so you got to be quick with that. So I'm looking for the word tradition. Didn't really see it there. Even if you miss it, it's fine. You can do, like, a reread. So even if I miss it, it's not really a big deal. Yeah, I don't really see it. I see here, tradition. So, certain artists in the 19th century, they tried to extend the professional tradition of painting so that it would express the experience of other classes. So in this case, they're talking about tradition as art really only appealing to the upper classes. And then I know I saw tradition over here. They're saying by the 20th century, the tradition was indeed dismantled. So in this case, they're talking about art as it applied to reflecting values of the social class. Sorry, the upper social class. That is what tradition was. They're saying by the 20th century, this was dismantled, and by this time, art was also for people of lower classes. But then in this passage, the author goes on to say that even though, like, that tradition was dismantled, the way that people were learning was still similar, and so it hadn't fully gone away, like the way that they painted. So that's what tradition is referring to. It's referring to the fact that before, art was really only for the upper social classes. Okay? So, like, look at a question, always try to figure out the answer in your head before you look at the passage again, because that saves time, but never choose the final answer without looking at the passage again. So I thought, something slightly different for tradition than what it was, but now I know what it is. So option A is saying, tradition refers to the best way to record and preserve eternal artistic truths. No. That phrasing was mentioned in the passage, and of course MCAT does that all the time. It'll mention, like, some phrasing you've seen in the passage, and then if you can't really figure out what else is going on, you might choose that because you recognize it a little bit. But nowhere in the passage does the author go on about, like, what is or isn't a truth. They're just saying that art should reflect something which, like, the person who's viewing the art should relate to. But they don't talk about, like, what is a truth, what isn't a truth. That wording, eternal artistic truth, was mentioned somewhere in the passage, but if you go back to it, it's not relating to, like, tradition. Option B is saying tradition refers to a set of artistic conventions that correspond to the social manners of a ruling elite. That is what I was talking about. The tradition was that art conventionally is for the ruling elite and not for others, but that was dismantled later on, around like 20th century. Option C is saying tradition refers to a system of applying mythological or symbolic elements to realistic subjects. No. I remember when this was mentioned when we were given that example, and we were told that someone was trying to paint an ordinary scene with some construction workers, but they accidentally made it mythological and symbolic. That's not what, in the context of the paragraph of the passage, that tradition was referring to. That was just like a one-time mentioned thing. And option D is saying tradition refers to the expansion of the area of artistic experience to include the unconscious. No. The unconscious was mentioned at some point, but that was mentioned to say that that is another source where people can draw an experience. That's one area where they can go outside of the conventions of their training, but that's because that is their unconscious, right? That's kind of that's an exception, but it's you don't really have to talk about that. It's just one exception, but it's not it breaks the rule which the author is talking about, which is that training limits you. But B is what tradition was in this passage. Moving on to question 90. The passage implies that art is at its best when blank. So there's an implication somewhere in the passage. So a lot of times you'll see an implication or an assumption that is an underlying thing which is there in the passage, right? So for this to happen, you have to think about, is the author's viewpoint there? Yes, it is there. Is the author arguing for something? Yes, the author is arguing that the training which people have limits their experience. He gave the example that someone was trying to paint for the lower classes, but then they couldn't really pull that off. So that must mean that the author likes it when paintings, they appeal to not specifically that they have to appeal to lower classes or something like that. The author seems to have a problem with training limiting you and you having a limited set of experience from which to draw on, right? So I guess the author would prefer it if you had more experiences, and then if you're trying to paint on a certain subject, that you would actually have experience with it and training in it before you can actually accurately portray it. But what does that imply about art? Let's start going through the answer options. Sometimes I can't really think about an answer in my head. I think about a little background information, but it's really when you go through the answer options that you get more clarity. So option A is saying the passage is implying is art's at its best when it transcends conventions. Yeah, I can see that. The author has a problem with conventions, which is you being tied down by your training. So that does imply that art is better when it transcends conventions. For example, transcending the convention that art is only for the ruling classes, and it's better, right? The author is showing this progressive way that art has evolved, and now it also appeals to lower classes, and then it should appeal to people who are not painters as well. So yeah, that goes hand in hand with this implication. Option B, that it records eternal truths. This is brought up in the last question as well, but the author is not going back and forth about eternal truths. They mention eternal truths somewhere in the passage, but it's not at all relating to the main point of the passage. So option A does relate to the main point of the passage, but yeah, in the passage, option B isn't really something which was discussed. The author is not really arguing anything about eternal truths and one thing being more true than another thing, and yeah, they're not implying that art is better when it records eternal truths. It can be about honestly anything. They're talking more so about the training and the conventions that the artist follows. Option C, that it reflects social manners. Once again, this is something that's not really getting at what the main point of the passage was. The author used social manners as the main thing which they talked about, so that was discussed a lot in the passage, but they were just saying that okay, this is one example. The social manners of the ruling class were a part of the training that the artists received, and then that limited them to display the social manners of that class when they were making their art. but the author isn't specifically saying or implying that social manners are what matter. The subject could be anything. Really, it matters that you can actually paint about whatever subject you're painting on. Finally, option D, we also remove that. Art is at its best when it treats religious themes. No. Religious themes was used when we had that example. The person who was trying to make art for the lower classes accidentally made it a religious looking painting. And if anything, the author had a problem with that it shouldn't have looked religious, and the problem was that the convention of how the person learned, they probably made a lot of religious paintings, and that's how they were trained to make paintings. That is what limited them from making art properly, and the author seemed to have a problem with the final piece that they made, but the author would have preferred it if that artist could transcend conventions and not make a religious painting and make an actual day-to-day scene that you would see. Okay, moving on. There are still 2 more questions. Question 91. According to the passage, why did past artistic conventions most likely correspond so closely to the social manners of the ruling classes? So, key thing here, according to the passage, right? Every question you take should have evidence in the passage. Don't worry about your own thinking. So, what is the author really implying? So, past artistic conventions corresponded to the social manners of the ruling classes. Yeah, so why were the conventions along with what the ruling classes did? Well, the author is saying training limits the artist in what they can actually make. And so if the training was given or influenced by the ruling class, then that would mean that now the artist makes something which corresponds to the social manners of the ruling class. If on the other hand training was given by the lower class, then those are the social manners which they would display in their painting. So we're looking for something that says training was influenced by ruling class. Option A is saying artists were interested in the narrowness and isolation of the ruling classes as a historical phenomenon. No. Narrowness and isolation, those were mentioned somewhere in the passage. Where were they? I think it was here. It's serious art of this period dealt with isolation and narrow experience of painting itself. That was talking about abstract art or whatever. And that's actually a bit later on if you're keeping track of the time period. So that's not even talking about the time period that we care about. We're worried more so about the earlier or the past artistic conventions. This is getting more so into modern day. So yeah, option A is incorrect. There's nothing to imply that artists were interested as a historical phenomenon in the ruling class, and the main message which they beat you down with was that the training is what matters. And of course, back in the day, the ruling class controlled the training because they were much more influential and richer, and it was seen that painting was really just for the upper classes. Option B is saying artists felt that the experiences of the ruling classes were the only kinds of activity worth recording. Once again, no evidence for that. No evidence that they cared about only those experiences. No evidence that, just like with option A, that they cared about that as a historical phenomenon. And you see a counterexample to that, right? Where you saw someone that's clearly trying to make something that was for the lower classes. And you see the author talking about a whole trend of people trying to appeal to the lower classes, and even though they had all this oppression and people fighting back against that, they still continue because they really cared. So that means that they did care about the experience of other classes than the ruling classes. Option C is saying artists aspire to the wealth and power of the ruling classes. Just like with B, that doesn't make sense, because then why wouldn't they only paint about the ruling classes? They also tried to paint about the lower classes. And just like with A, there's no evidence that this is something they cared about. Sure, probably a lot of artists did care about wealth and power, but we can't say that as a general rule for all artists. But D does make sense. Artists look to the members of the ruling class for financial support. So if those are the people that are their patrons, those are the people that are giving them money in order to buy equipment and have a job and actually paint, then they're going to reflect the social values or social manners of that class, right? Whoever influences the training you receive is going to influence the paintings that you make. Alright, this is the last question, 92. The discussion of that example, Ford Madox Brown's painting work, what does that show? So the discussion shows what? What is the main reason for that painting being shown? Well, going back to the passage, like around that time in that part of the passage, what was being discussed is that there's a shift and now artists are trying to make things for other classes as well. This example is shown because this artist made a painting which tried to appeal to the lower classes, but it had a drawback where it seemed religious when it really shouldn't have been. So it shows that even though this person is trying to break the conventions and do something unique, and they spent like 10 years working on this, even so they couldn't break past the conventions of their training and the limited set of experience that they had from their training. That's the main purpose. So option A is saying that example shows that the process of expanding the subject matter of professional art is complex and extremely difficult to achieve. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's what we're looking for. You are trying to expand the subject matter, but it's extremely difficult to do that. Option B is saying art that deals with realistic subjects is more powerful than abstract art. This is just a random answer. Art that deals with realistic subjects is more powerful than abstract art. I mean, the author does kind of dismiss abstract art at the end, but like the whole passage isn't about the problems the author had with abstract art or anything like that. That's just like a small thing added at the end, and also that is something which came afterwards. Like abstract art wasn't even mentioned when we had the discussion of this specific painting. So there's nothing in the passage which says that the author believes one type of art is better than another, except art which transcends conventions. Option C is saying the problems inherent in expanding the subject matter of art are still with us today. No. There was like a timeline progression. The author went more and more into modern time and said that, it's still like a problem. The author didn't specifically go too much into modern day, except for talking about like, yeah, it's still a problem because like abstract art is really for painters, and other people who don't paint don't really get it. But once again, that's like a discussion that came afterwards. Discussion of what problems are still inherent today came after the discussion of this painting. A is a much better answer because that's specifically why that example was given, to lend evidence to that point. And finally, option D is saying the relationship between the professional artists and the ruling classes is complicated and should not be simplified. I mean, that's kind of relating to like one sentence that opened out the passage. What was the sentence again? The sentence is saying the relationship of the artist to the class that ruled was complicated and it should not be simplified. That's like the opening sentence. But that's not really relevant to this discussion of that painting specifically. Yeah, that discussion wasn't about the relationship between a professional artist and the ruling classes. That discussion was more so about this person trying to appeal to the lower classes. So it wasn't really even relevant to their ruling classes, except for the fact that the person was trained by the ruling classes and then they painted according to those values. Because of that, we removed the other answer options. Option A is, like even before I looked at the answer options, it was pretty much what I had in my head, and it's correct, and it matches with what the main point of the passage is. For all those reasons, we choose answer option A. And that is it for the questions in this passage, and that's it for the questions in this video. So hopefully you guys got a lot out of going through these different passages, going through questions, and even though it was long-winded, and of course when you actually write the MCAT and when you do your practice, you should try to be a bit faster. But what the main takeaway from this video should be is that this is the type of thinking that you should have. Think like this when you're going through the passages. Think like this when you're going through the different questions. Of course, we'll put up more videos going through like bio and the behavioral sciences as well, but it's generally the same thing. So just, think critically of everything you're reading and what the questions are asking you to find. And then as you do this, like I tried to break it down slowly here in this video, but for me, I do this naturally and it comes much quicker, and I can still do this and finish the test within the time limits that I'm given. And if you do this and do a lot of practice, for sure you can also apply this within the time limits that you're given, and you guys will do great on the MCAT when you eventually write it. And if there are any questions, for like any question where you don't feel like the explanation was fully to like the standards that you wanted, it didn't really explain, and you still have some questions, then like type that out below, we'll try to give further discussion, and hopefully other people can also answer and help you out as well. But that sums up this video. It sums up all the passages that we're going to be going through. Look out for more videos in the future. And at the end, if you look down in the description, you will see that we have a course, right? We have a 30-day MCAT course. All the information for that is down below. You can check out our website. We also have like a webinar that plays from time to time, and it can give you more details on what is in the course. But essentially, what you saw here is what is going to be present in the course. We have lecture videos going through all the different topics that are covered on the MCAT and explaining those topics to you, but like at the level that you need to know for the MCAT. We don't try to go like way too beyond, because you don't have to for the MCAT. And then a lot of videos for like over 1,000 questions, going through the questions, going through the answers, breaking it down like you saw here, and then trying to teach you this method of approaching questions critically as well. So if you like what you saw, make sure to check out the link and see if this course is right for you. We call it 30-day MCAT course. You don't have to only be willing to study for 30 days to take this course. We have schedules for 30 days, but also for 60 days, for 90 days, or just however long you need to study. So you can just get in the course, you can move along at your own pace. The main thing is, if you like what you saw in this video, then check out our course. And that is it for this video. I'm going to end it off here. If you have any more questions, reach out to us, social media, email, everything like that. So thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one.